Hi, I'm Richmond Heath, Physiotherapist from TRE Australia. And today's presentation is everything you need to know about adrenaline. But it's not really just about adrenaline, it's also about what you need to know about cortisol. And through that, the links to burnout and also PTSD. And more importantly, how to help prevent it. Now, we don't really need to go into the details or the scientific details about adrenaline. It's both a hormone and also a neurotransmitter. It's not only released by the adrenal glands, but there's also a release of adrenaline, or production and release of adrenaline from within the brainstem as well. Now, anyone who's worked in emergency services has already experienced adrenaline. You know what it feels like when there's a rush or there's a dump of adrenaline or you feel that surge. And what's really critical to understand is that adrenaline is not the enemy. It's not the problem. Because the whole point of adrenaline is to give your body the energy to start to move and take action to deal with stresses. So a number of different things happen. We get improved focus and learning ability. We get more energy. Adrenaline helps increase our strength, sometimes up to 40%. It helps to distract us from pain, and it can even improve our immunity. Now, research has shown that the stronger our response is to stresses, the healthier we are, because it gives our body the power and strength to fight or flee even more effectively. So having a strong response to a stressful situation during a disaster at work or wherever it might be is actually a sign of health and vitality, as long as we're able to let that adrenaline dissipate afterwards. And after we've experienced a stressor and adrenaline has been released in a matter of seconds, that adrenaline, even if the stressor finishes, will generally last up to 1 hour in our system unless it's used up for movement. Now, one of the most important things you need to know about adrenaline is it does not cause the body to shake and tremble. We experience it and we find the body shaking and trembling after a stressful or traumatic event. And so we often just think this is a sign of adrenaline. But let's have a look at this video. Here's a young kid shaking and trembling after shooting a deer.
Did you get him? Where'd he go?
So let me ask you this. How is that shaking helping his body to fight or to flee?
You weren't shaking before you shot him.
And obviously it's not helping his fight or flight or stress response. It's not helping his body to move and mobilize. This is how the body dissipates adrenaline. Here's another few examples. Here's a polar bear that's running away. It's about to get anesthetized through a darker.
See the pads there are sort of like but he hasn't started to really chip his teeth. If you watch that animal after he finishes convulsing, you'll see, because he's aware of the fact that we're all around him, and it's a very stressful experience for an animal like a polar bear. After he settles down, and then he'll start doing a couple of deep breaths, and then he'll breathe really nicely, and it'll really... Now look, here he goes. See how he's breathing there now? You can see, so that even though it looks a little unpleasant to look at him convulsing like that, in fact, it lets off all that stress, and he then is able to relax and sleep the thing off.
In this video, you'll see an impala that's been caught by a leopard. Effectively, the body looks so in shock that it almost looks like it's dead. You can hardly see any movement. But gradually, as the body comes back out of that extremely high adrenaline state, it starts to spontaneously shake and tremble. Eventually, dumping that adrenaline, restoring it back to homeostasis, so now it's free to go about its day. Now, anyone who's worked in emergency services has already seen this. Now you can see in the video, at this point, the person's doing a great job just holding her, supporting her, but often when the shaking's coming, you'll see other people are coming trying to stop it, because we generally think this is a sign of overwhelm rather than recognizing this as the body's spontaneous way of calming itself down, something that we can deliberately support and encourage in people who have just been through a traumatic event to help them recover and release their shock. Now, as I mentioned, adrenaline generally stays in the body for up to an hour, and if it's used up, generally not a problem. So the real problem with adrenaline is not actually about adrenaline at all. It's actually more about cortisol. You'll see in this graph here that whenever we have a stressful response, whether it's real or even whether it's perceived, like we're worried about lack of control at work or shifts or the boss is not being fair, the body has a quick release of adrenaline, which is really about increasing our energy and our capacity to deal with short-term stresses. But at the same time, the release of adrenaline triggers the release of cortisol. Now, cortisol is also a hormone, and the difference about cortisol is it takes longer, much longer to be released over many, many minutes. It stays in the system for longer, and so its real output, its real purpose is to generate long-term energy for dealing with longer-term stress. So the beautiful thing about cortisol is it gives you endurance. Adrenaline gives you that quick impulse and that urge so you can take action and deal with the stressor, but cortisol is vital in emergency services because it allows you to endure and to keep going and give you stamina so you can keep dealing with the stresses on an ongoing basis. Now, again, just like adrenaline, cortisol is not the enemy. Cortisol is a very natural and normal part of our daily cycle. And you can see in this graph here how our normal relaxed levels of cortisol have a big spike early in the morning, which wakes us up, stimulates us, wakes our mind up, wakes our body up, and then generally will dissipate and calm down across the course of the day to repeat the cycle the next day. The problem with working in disaster management and emergency services, however, is that there are regular stresses throughout the day or ongoing stresses over lots of periods of time. And each time the body releases a little bit more adrenaline in response to a stressor, then the body also releases a little bit more cortisol. And so throughout the day, we tend to gradually be increasing the cortisol level. So at the end of the shift, we're actually quite stimulated. The problem comes, however, when these hormones don't go back to their naturally balanced homeostatic levels. And this is really where cortisol is so critical because it's the hormone of burnout and also largely post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, what most people don't realize when we think about burnout is we think we're going fine and everything's okay, and then all of a sudden we start to get into this thing called burnout where we lose energy. But there's actually 3 stages of burnout. And the first stage of burnout is the stage where we have high energy. In this first stage of burnout, we've got high adrenaline and high cortisol. And because of these hormones, we're often functioning really well. In fact, we're often performing at our peak or above our normal levels of performance. And what's critical is at this point, we don't even realize we've got a problem with burnout. Because at this stage, we're not experiencing fatigue. There's no symptoms. There's no lack of energy. In fact, we often feel really good because we feel really alive and switched on. It's part of what we love about working in emergency services in disasters. You never feel more alive than when adrenaline and cortisol is going through your body and your veins and you're doing really critical and important work. The difficulty, however, is that this first state of high adrenaline is unsustainable. But again, let me remind you that generally we don't even know we've got a problem because this is very much the culture of our emergency services organisations. Now, one of the first red flags is the inability to switch off or unwind at the end of your shift or at the end of the day or morning or whenever you're finishing. So for example, if you're finding it takes you more than 10 or 15 minutes to fall asleep, that can be very much a sign that you've got high cortisol levels that are keeping your mind and your body still aroused and awake. You might also find that you wake up regularly throughout the night, which is not necessarily uncommon, but you may find that you have difficulty getting back to sleep once you've woken. One of the other things that happens is before we're even aware of low energy or stress or psychological distress is that our body starts to bear the burden. we start to experience chronic aches and pains because with the ongoing levels of cortisol, our blood flow and the energy and the tension in the body is chronically activated into our neuromuscular system and the muscles of our neuromuscular system and the muscles of movement. So we often start getting physical complaints even though we don't think they've got anything yet to do with burnout. Another red flag is that we often find difficulties of just unwinding, and we start to need things and stimulants to either help us numb out, like alcohol and gambling or mindlessly watching TV, or we start to use stimulants to keep us feeling amped up and ramped up, because that starts to feel like our normal, that high energy state. And then when we're not in that high energy state, we start to feel a bit flat and depressed. And it's this same process of not being able to switch off in the neurobiology or the physiology of the body that also leads to post-traumatic stress disorder, whether that's from a one-off critical incident or the effects of accumulative trauma that build and cause us to harden up over the course of our careers. But thankfully, our body has a way that you've already seen to switch off this adrenaline, to switch off this sympathetic arousal stress response, to reduce the adrenaline, to calm our heart rate and restore our physiology back to a calm, relaxed state. This is a fantastic study that was done where people were measuring the way that dogs were responding on their daily walk, and they were comparing the difference between on-lead walking and off-lead walking. But they found something unexpected that they weren't even looking for. You'll see here the dog, as it shakes, the graph at the bottom is a monitor monitoring its heart rate. So you can see that little green dot is going down. The shaking has reduced the stress response. You can see there, that dog's heart rate was rising. A little shake, as soon as the shake happens, it changes the direction the heart rate is going in. It stops it from going further up into a stress response or a high, and it calms the body down. Now, we can also deliberately invoke this shaking and tremoring reflex using an innovative new body-based technique called TRE.
This video is a great example of 6 different people from around the world who have activated the tremor mechanism by doing the tension and trauma releasing exercises. This man is a fireman from Brazil. He was in a workshop with 250 other policemen and firemen. You could see he's simply laying passively on the floor after he's activated the tremor mechanism. Here's an example of a community leader from an indigenous population. He's learning the exercises so he can guide his community through the exercises as they experience stress, traumas, and anxieties. Now here is a military policeman who activated the tremor mechanism, and you could see that they're going through his legs into the pelvis and into his lower back. This next policeman, who's a civil policeman, was at the same workshop. And then at the end, they simply lay their legs down and relax.
In Australia, elite athletes are already using TRE because they can't wait for the science to catch up, and neither can we. TRE has also been introduced to emergency service organisations in many countries around the world, as well as military personnel. Now, regardless of whether you use TRE or any other calming technique, it's critical that you start to train your body how to switch off. Because when we're not switching off, it's not until later on down the track that we start to move into the second phase of burnout, which is where we start to experience fluctuating adrenaline, cortisol, or fluctuating energy levels. And then if that doesn't get interrupted, we move into the third and final stage of burnout, commonly referred to as adrenal fatigue, which is where we start to experience what we classically think of as burnout, where we have low energy. We've lost our motivation and our energy both at work and also at home. And if we don't interrupt and prevent these steps towards burnout, we end up with the harsh reality of people quitting their jobs. And that's tragic both for yourself as a first responder, because you can no longer do the job and the work that you love doing and that service, but also it comes at a huge cost to the community because of the impact it has on you, but also the cost to the organisation in needing to retrain people and difficulty recruiting staff. Down the track, even if you do quit your job, These chronic states of high adrenaline, high activation in the sympathetic nervous system also lead to a huge range of chronic diseases weeks, months, years, decades down the track. Things like cardiovascular disease, stroke, diabetes, weight gain and obesity, and even things like cancer. These chronic states of hyperarousal also lead to a huge range of complications around our mental health, whether it's chronic anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress, substance abuse, and sadly, all too often, suicide. This final part of the talk is really targeted towards wellbeing managers, people in training academies, and ultimately senior management and commissioners. Because what we need to recognise is the current culture of emergency services is one of high adrenaline. But what a healthy adrenaline cycle actually looks like is that people do have high adrenaline and high cortisol while they're at work. They're switched on meeting the challenges that they're facing, but critically, a healthy adrenaline cycle means that adrenaline and cortisol levels are switched off and back to normal before they leave work at the end of their shift. This is not just a moral obligation that we have towards our first responders, but with the passing of the recent laws in relation to workplace safety, it's also now a legal requirement that emergency service organisations are doing more to prevent the kinds of physical and mental health conditions that are caused by this chronic activation of adrenaline and cortisol. And in other countries around the world, the benefits of TRE and deliberately using this spontaneous shaking response are profound.
When I learned this technique, I was convinced that I needed to tell it to everyone that I could ever talk to, any veteran that I met that I knew that was struggling.
The first time I did it, very skeptical. I'd been through enough treatments that didn't work. I was not so gullible, but it did work. And it was pretty easy to learn, but it had a profound impact. These simple exercises were doing wonders for me. I slept the first night I did it.
If I would have known TRE then, in Kosovo or in Afghanistan, if my team would have known it when we were deployed, we could use it once a week, once every second day, discharge that stress, instead of growing a bit numb and taking larger, bigger risks.
The trauma release exercise pretty much saved my life. It saved my relationship when I was struggling.
It doesn't cost anything. Once you learn it, you have it for the rest of your life, and you can share it with everyone you know. I will do everything I can do to make sure the military looks at this, studies it, evaluates it, and inculcates it into our warriorship. It's a missing component. It's a missing link to completing the cycle of warriorship so that you can own your experience and not be owned by it.